Hello everyone and welcome to our final presentation. My name is Bryson Cole and I will be the presenter today. We're excited to show our findings on how we can better help the Utah State University admissions process and also the department as a whole. Oh my gosh. This wouldn't be possible without our great team. Although I'm the face, really the work all behind the scenes is done by Bailey Boaz, Emmy Facer, McKate Norton, Samantha Peterson, and Aaron Van Someren. So I want to say thank you to all of them for them being able to make this presentation great. So to give a little background, Utah State University was founded in 1888. Utah State is ranked number 5 in online bachelor's programs nationwide, and we have over 35,000 students enrolled at Utah State University. The main purpose of our research is to essentially see how other colleges similar to Utah State perceive the university and how that affects prospective or transfer students' desires to attend here. So to jump into what our decision problem was, is Utah State perceived differently from other Utah State universities? The research problem is, how does that perception of Utah State University affect the decision-making process of both prospective students, both in and out of state, when deciding whether to apply to Utah State or another school? And the way that we did this was through quantitative and qualitative research, through a Qualtrics survey that we're going to touch on a little bit later, through personal interviews that we all conducted, secondary research through various colleges, and how their admissions are perceived. So the process in which was a 5-step process. So the first was that we assessed comparable university admissions processes. And the way that we did that was through different articles that we found. And in one of those articles that we found, and that through research on Utah State's website, was that Utah State has a 97% admission rate, where that compares a lot different to elite schools like Harvard, Stanford, and many other of those elite schools, where some of those are less than 10% admissions rate. And so our goal was to find, what makes them different and why they're restricting their admissions, whereas Utah State is accepting just about anybody. And so the second was personal interviews with Utah State students, where we each had the opportunity to sit down and interview with each person. The third was a sampling plan, which is where that Qualtrics survey comes into place, where we sent it out to 10,000 prospective and then current students. That survey was built from the whole class, from our market research class, which consisted roughly of about 50 different students. And then we distributed that through a Qualtrics survey. So the Qualtrics survey had various questions. Most that we found were good, were the qualitative questions. So some of the pros of that is that, we had a lot of different minds working on this survey. So we had over 50 students collaborating with questions that we could come up with, and just making the questions a lot more simple. So we had a lot of people working on it, which really helped out. Most of the questions that gave us the most data was the quantifiable questions, and we really didn't have too many qualitative questions. Some of the cons of the Qualtrics survey that we found was that we only have 469 responses to the 10,000 that we sent out. So very, very small return on what we sent out. And one of the other cons that we found was that respondents get tired of answering questions that are not their true feeling toward admissions. So what we mean by that is that when students get this, they may or may not be going through the admissions process, so they don't really have any feelings, they don't have any biases, good or bad, so they just didn't fill out the survey. Some of the questions, to give you an idea of what they were based on, some qualitative questions were deciding on, what was your deciding factor on coming to Utah State? Was it your location? Was it the cost? Was it the cost of living? So on and so forth. And then another question, qualitative, was, are you a first-generation college student? And then some of the quantitative questions was, what is your gender? Are you male or female? Or what do you identify as? Did you end up coming to Utah State? Did you accept that letter of application and come here? And then what was your concurrent high school GPA? And so to answer those questions, to give you an idea of what the responses were like, we had 80% of the 469 respondents were female, 20% were male, and 20% were 79% of those that responded to the survey came to Utah State, which I think kind of goes to show the quality of students. I mean, if you look at the next bullet point, the average GPA was a 3.5 to 4.0. So depending on, I mean, how you look at that, I see that as we're really getting the cream of the crop of those high school students. You're getting the best of the best. And so that are responding to this, and 80% of those 469 are coming, or 79% are coming to Utah State. So the first test that we performed was a couple t-tests on 3 different sample groups. The first 2 really weren't too surprising, but the third was where we found some really interesting data. So the first t-test that we performed was the difference between males and females in their first preference choice, if it was Utah State University and if it was somewhere else. And there really wasn't any significant difference between men and women in their preference on Utah State. The second one, the second t-test that we performed was whether Utah State University was the first preference for in and out of state students. And there really wasn't any significant difference in that either. So the third was the difference between in and out of state students that were already accepted and attending Utah State University. And here's where it got really interesting. Out of all of the applicants, in-state applicants, 80% ended up attending Utah State, whereas out of state, only 72% applicants attended Utah State.
Ew.
The second test that we performed against the data was the chi-square test. And what we found as our alternate hypothesis was that the choice to attend Utah State is very much dependent on the overall experience with the admissions process. And so as you can see on our graph, the number of people, which is about 150, that were very satisfied with the overall experience, attended Utah State. So the blue is those that ended up attending Utah State versus the orange that did not. So you can see a very high correlation with their experience level versus if they were dissatisfied, they wouldn't come. And it's about 6s as you get closer down to the bottom. Our second chi-test that we performed with the data was based on the question from this Qualtrics survey that said, what is your main deciding factor to come to Utah State University? And as you can see, these are all different answers that we provided in that survey. So the first was location, and then cost, quality, academic program, social life, family, meaning do you have family that come to Utah State or that live around Utah State, and then other. And we found that it's pretty directly correlated that cost influences people to come to Utah State. With many different schools here in Utah, you could go to Snow College, you could go to SUU, you could go to a trade school such as Bridgerland Technology, or you could go to Paul Mitchell Hair School even here in the Valley. There's tons of different opportunities, and most of the opportunities that have been chosen are based on cost. And as you can see, academic program and location were really close for the second one. Even though it's interesting that Logan is off I-15 and I-84, that people would still choose Logan as their location to come to school. So it was directly dependent on cost, is what we found. Our third chi-square test that we performed was based off the question from the survey that asked potential students whether they had a scholarship to come to Utah State. So we had 3 different categories: whether you didn't have a scholarship at all, whether you had a part-time scholarship, or whether you had a full-time scholarship. And what we found from the respondents, of the 466 respondents, was that 85 people didn't have a scholarship to come here. And whereas 215 people who had a part-time scholarship decided to come to Utah State, and only 62 people had a full-time scholarship to come to Utah State and attend. And we found that all of these variables are independent of each other. So what that means is whether people had a scholarship, based off those 85 people, if they had a scholarship or not, those 85 people didn't have a scholarship, but they still came to Utah State and attended. And so this all falls back onto the perception of Utah State and what the university is about. And so that ties directly back to our research and decision problems stated in the first couple of slides. And so we found, just based off of this chi-square test, that the value of Utah State is higher than other schools in Utah because so many people are coming here on part-time and no scholarships at all. They outweigh the people that have full-time scholarships by a hefty amount. So our other test that we performed on the data was an ANOVA test, and it was based on the question that we asked the respondents. We said, rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how important these categories are to you. And those categories were academic quality, research/hands-on learning opportunities, affordability, and employment opportunities. And so with this ANOVA test, we compared the means, the average, against each other. And what we found that although they're very similar, they're not, or they are independent because the means are not the same. And so what was the lowest was the employment opportunities at 3.47. So people perceived that the employment opportunities were not quite as high as, say, the academic quality at 3.9 to them. So they felt that they were getting a good academic quality, just not necessarily the job maybe that they wanted or that they were getting paid more to do. And so the categories of comparison of academic institutions in the state of Utah have unequal means. Our next model that we ran was a regression analysis, and what we ran it on was the grade point average of a 4.0 on a scale of 4.0 versus the number of universities applied to. So if somebody had a low GPA, did they apply to more universities than, say, someone with a high GPA? So what we found was that there was no direct correlation between those that had a lower GPA versus those that had a higher GPA. So there's no association based on GPA of whether somebody had a 2.0 GPA and versus those that had a 4. And you can see that we didn't even have 2 people that said that they didn't apply to any schools, which if they got this survey, they would have applied to at least Utah State. So we do have some outliers, but we didn't find anything back from this model based on GPA and the number of universities applied to. Our second regression model that we ran was based off of the question that asked, on a scale of 1 to 5, where are these most important to you? And again, those different answers that people could give on a scale of 1 to 5 was academic quality, research/hands-on learning opportunities, affordability, and employment opportunities. And after we ran the data, it was really interesting because 2 were dependent and 2 were independent of each other and why they ended up coming to Utah State. And so in this regression model, all of these questions that are asked really show whether they came to Utah State or not, depending on the answers that they gave. And so based off of the graph here, that are highlighted in green, academic quality and affordability show that they are dependent on them coming to Utah State. And then the other 2, research/hands-on learning opportunities and employment opportunities, are independent of the data. And so this keeps going back to what we've proved in our graphs and our other analyses, that academic quality and affordability are the reasons why people continue to come to Utah State. And we're actually going to talk about that more in our recommendations. One of the questions that we asked on the survey was, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not at all likely and 10 being extremely likely, how likely would you be to recommend Utah State to a friend or family member? And so from this question alone, you can figure out what's called a Net Promoter Score. And so a Net Promoter Score is on a scale from -100 all the way to 100. And so it falls into 3 categories of these answers. So from those that rate from a 1 to 6 on that scale are what are called detractors. And then those that give a number 7 and 8 are those that are called passives. So those are the people that are kind of impartial. And then 9 and 10, that's kind of your money. That's where you really want to focus a lot of your time, because those are your promoters. And so those are people that are going to go out and promote the school and really try and bring others to Utah State based off of their experience. And so as you can see from the data, over 50% of our respondents, whether they came to Utah State or not, are still going to go out and promote Utah State. And then you have 29% that are passives that are really not going to say bad, but not say good about Utah State. And then you have the 19% in yellow at the top that are detractors. They're going to say bad stuff on Utah State in their experience through it. And so in a perfect world, you want to have a 100 Net Promoter Score, meaning that everybody's going to go out and promote your brand, everybody's going to go promote Utah State. But based off of our findings, after you factor in all three of these groups, you have a Net Promoter Score of 33, which is hard to correlate between other schools in Utah because we don't really have a benchmark of Net Promoter Scores to go off of. So we felt like 33 was good, not great for what it is. We feel like we could at least get more of those 134 people to be promoters. With the 90, it's kind of hard, but at least try and transition them to be either a passive or a promoter for Utah State University. So finally, our recommendations for Utah State in their admissions department. The first recommendation that we propose is that Utah State advertises academic quality and affordability. And I feel like they already do a pretty good job, but we feel like Utah State could hit it more on the head, because based off of our second regression analysis that we garnered from our results is that students and potential students stress the academic quality and affordability when coming to Utah State. And so really blasting that out and making sure that everybody knows that it's cost friendly. You're getting a better return for coming to Utah State. You're going to get a better academic learning and pay less than anywhere else. The second is that we propose for additional research using the freshman orientation program. So the reason why we propose that is because you have tons of incoming freshmen that are coming to campus before school even starts. Their academic application is pretty fresh on their mind. If you can sit them down and force them to take a survey, they're going to be way more excited to take it in a setting on campus than at home. So you're going to have more results. We're not going to have 469 out of 10,000 people respond. We think that we could get much higher than that. The third is that we issue surveys to high school students that are applying to schools. This will give us a little bit more of kind of real-time feedback of what they're thinking as they're applying to other schools and why they are not choosing Utah State or why they are choosing Utah State. And then the fourth is issue a survey and outreach to out-of-state students. Because we found that out-of-state students, only 72% that are already here, they came here, that actually got accepted. So we need to figure out, Utah State needs to figure out why those out-of-state students that are getting accepted that are not coming to Utah State. Because there's that 28% window that when Utah State could potentially go after. So we feel like with these four recommendations, not only are you going to get better feedback on the admissions process, but you're going to get higher quality students because you're going to get their real-time feedback. As a reminder, we want to say that although we have all of these data points, this is not reflective of a full population. We'd like to thank you for your participation in this presentation. At this time, we would also like to ask for any questions that you may have that we can maybe clarify with our data. Please reach out to us on Canvas for further questions. Thank you. On behalf of Team 8.